Donc nous allons maintenant écouter Anna Yohalem qui va nous parler de la tête casquée de Boisgeloup. Anna Yohalem est doctorante au département d'Art et d'Archéologie de l'Université de Princeton. Elle discutera notamment dans sa présentation de la relation de la tête casquée de 1933 dont le MoMA de New York conserve le plâtre original avec la boule suspendue de 1930 de Giacometti. Le Musée national Picasso prépare une exposition Picasso-Giacometti en partenariat avec la Fondation Giacometti pour octobre 2016. Et nous entendrons aussi tout à l'heure Serena Bucalo qui nous parlera de ce lien entre les deux artistes. Je passe tout de suite la parole à Anna Yohalem.
Merci. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me and to the Museum Research Consortium at MoMA for the opportunity to begin working on this topic. Picasso created Head of a Warrior in his Boisgeloup studio in 1933. With its prominent crest and ambivalent smirk, it is tempting to consider it as a humorous one-off, comically jabbing at the image of the hero. As is so often the case with Picasso's work, however, this sculpture should not be taken in isolation within his oeuvre. In its formal concerns, it is closely related to the series of plaster sculptures of a woman's head that Picasso made in Boisgeloup over the prior 2 years. And the figure of the helmeted warrior proliferates in the etchings Picasso also made in 1933 to accompany Gilbert Seldis's English translation of Aristophanes' Greek comedy Lysistrata. Yet these contexts internal to Picasso's work do not exhaust Head of a Warrior's connotations either. Instead, they allow us, as I argue, to see the sculpture as a response, and a defensive one at that, to shifts in artistic and political spheres taking shape beyond the walls of Picasso's studio. So first, to the artistic sphere. Picasso began his series of volumetric plaster heads with this one, a fairly classical depiction of Marie Tessé-Walter. Rapidly, he began playing with the eyes, pushing the face, elongating the nose and bulging or recessing the eyes, pushing the face into phallic territory. But he also moved towards greater clarity and formal simplicity, melding the nose into the forehead and forming the hair into its own volume. This is the sculptural type, not the other, that would populate the artist's studio images that Picasso etched in the spring of 1933, and it would eventually appear as part of the Vollard suite of prints. In these etchings, sculpture, rather than painting, stands in for the artist's craft as such. The clear arcing lines of the sculpture's volumetric forms and its columnar neck-cum-base flatten into the literal lines of the profile that faces the artist as he works or doesn't work in the studio, as the case may be. With Head of a Warrior that same year, Picasso transferred the classicism of the form of the earlier Head of a Woman and the literally classical themes of the Vollard prints, as well as the Aristophanes project, back into his sculptural material. By flattening the woman's hair into the warrior's crest, Picasso makes the underlying flat structure of the supporting chicken wire all the more apparent, as you can see here in Bernet's photograph of the unfinished sculpture. Indeed, the plaster not only visually unifies, but also literally holds together tennis ball eyes, a chicken wire crest, a spine made of twisted wire and piping, a crowbar at the back of the neck, and nails that support the top curve of the nose. It is this sense of unity and stasis that makes this work, as well as the other Boisgeloup heads, function as counter-arguments to another well-known plaster work, namely Alberto Giacometti's Suspended Ball of 1930. Giacometti's sculpture was first shown at the Galerie Pierre in Paris in the fall of 1930. If Picasso did not see it then, he was certainly aware of it soon after. If not from the surrealist buzz about it, then at least from Giacometti's drawings, published in 1931. The Objet mobile et moi, which included Suspended Ball among his other surrealist objects and constructions, was an undeniable source for Picasso's anatomy drawings of 1933. Reinhold Hohl also argues that Picasso's club and sphere forms from his project for a monument inform Suspended Ball, and yesterday Carmen Jimenez linked the monument further to Giacometti's palace at 4 a.m. So it is tempting to see Head of a Warrior as a forceful counter-response in this exchange in which Picasso defends himself against the onslaught of surrealism and their appropriation of his work. So what is the character of this response? Suspended ball couples a sphere hanging from the top of a metal cage-like space with a larger crescent-shaped reclining form. Contact between the two is continuously held on the edge of fulfillment. The sphere, with its darkly shadowed crescent cutout, hovers over the wedge form. It is both testicular and feminine, actively biting and passively being cut, moving with gravity and air and symbolically isolated from the surrounding space through the metal armature. Head of a warrior, in turn, unites the two abstract elements and internalizes the support structure. Picasso transforms crescent into crest. He collapses the fierce cutout into the thin, smirking mouth. He distorts the clarity of Giacometti's two forms into a misshapen head, leaving the tennis ball eyes as duplicated, caricatured echoes of the elegant suspended sphere, freezing both the gender play and the literal movement of Giacometti's shapes. As early as 1930, Carl Einstein argued in Documents that Picasso's, quote, answer to the fatality of the unconscious is a prodigious wish for clearly intelligible figuration. So if the earlier Boisjoli heads were already answers of a sort to suspended balls' unbounded psychosexual metaphorics, why return decisively to the series and to Suspended Ball in 1933 with Head of a Warrior? It is, I believe, because the Surrealists were seeking Picasso out that year. André Breton, in particular, was attempting to claim him for his cause. The first issue of the Surrealist journal Minotaur appeared in May 1933 with Picasso's artwork on the cover and his anatomy drawings inside, along with Breton's essay on Picasso dans son élément and Bressai's photographs, including some of the Boisjoli studios and sculptures, but not Head of the Warrior. Even as Picasso willingly participated in Minotaur, he fought his incorporation into the Surrealist narrative and methodology. In Head of a Warrior, he moves beyond the classical unity of the slightly earlier sculptural heads, which Bressai's photographs were recouping for Surrealism, and adds in the further stasis of the profile, the relief, and the type. The flat plane of the warrior's crest and the protruding left eye pull the viewer around to see the sculpture in profile. Its less finished right side further emphasizes the priority of the singular side view. Indeed, taken together, the crest and the triangular corrugated section at the base of the neck describe a flat plane that bisects the head vertically, such that the sculpture can best be understood as a profile in relief built out from a suggested ground plane. Picasso then separates out the various degrees of relief and enumerates them alongside one another, from the straight cut of the mouth to the pupil's shallow indentation, from the deeper holes and ridge of the crest decoration, all the way to the intricate petal-like folds of the ear and the eyeball's absurd protubescence. The viewer sees depth always in relation to a series of parallel planes. Even the bulge of the cheek and nose read as if they were built out from the common ground plane. Because of the plane of the crest, Head of a Warrior is almost always photographed in full profile. But even when seen somewhat more obliquely, the crest still establishes a background against which the other features stand out. This is in stark contrast to the full three-dimensionality of this earlier Head of a Warrior, for example. The relief, as understood traditionally and discussed in the 19th century aesthetic theories of Adolf von Hildebrand, unifies through its pictorial address. Quote, the thousandfold judgments and movements of our observations find in this mode of presentation their stability and clearness, he writes. In this way, the visual content is universally arranged, bound together, and put in repose, end quote. Picasso inaugurated the series of Boisjoli heads with just such a bounded and clear relief in 1931, and would, as I mentioned earlier, turn to the literal pictorial clarity of the profile in the representations of sculpture in the Vollard suite images. Picasso's use of plaster further allows this type of unification to take place on the material level by subsuming Head of a Warrior's diverse construction materials. And even at the level of the figure, Head of a Warrior emphasizes clarity and stability. A single attribute, the helmet, that is in fact just a fanning crest connected directly to the figure's head, defines him as a generic warrior. This figure has neither backstory nor developmental potential, and the translation of the French title tête casquée, helmeted head, into the English Head of a Warrior makes this equation between attribute and identity all the more apparent. If the head and crest of head of a warrior halt suspended ball's literal and metaphorically ungrounded movement, compressing it into the pictorial univocality of the profile, the relief, and the type, the relationship between the top and bottom sections of the sculpture asserts Picasso's own power of material transformation. The face of the imprinted cardboard box at the bottom of the work juts out on just enough of a diagonal to break away from the relief's ground. This slight torque brings the base into the real three-dimensional space opened up between the metal pipe and the pseudopod-like plaster column. Split between bottom and top, head of a warrior thus displays the transition that Picasso facilitates from the raw space and materials of life into the unified, constructed forms of art. And plaster here, with the imprint of the corrugated cardboard and the box, functions as the prime material in which he can literally embed his transformational process. Within the year, the transformation of raw material texture into figural representation, facilitated by plaster, would be the central concern of his work, as with the bust of a bearded man of 1933, of his plaster work. Head of a warrior thus stands as a defensive statement of artistic practice, foregrounding Picasso's ability to change matter into figure and to morph one figure into another within his own oeuvre, as is apparent in this later Cartier-Bresson photograph of the studio. This type of figuration, even as it allows for play across works, is in stark contrast to the chains of unresolvable sexual and gendered associations that suspended ball continuously generates within itself. If in 1933 Picasso was staking out his artistic position in relation to developments in the Parisian art world, Head of a Warrior also addresses the reviving militarism of interwar Europe. Picasso was busy in 1933. As I've already discussed the Vollard suite and the other Boisjoli heads at some length, I will now turn to the illustrations for the English translation of Aristophanes' Lysistrata, which he made the same year. Lysistrata, in brief, is a Greek comedy mocking and disparaging war. In it, the women of Athens and the women of Sparta agree to withhold sex from their husbands and lovers until the men have reached a truce that would end the Peloponnesian War. The women eventually succeed in the play, and the men, hungry for sexual satisfaction, reach the truce that eluded them through many years of battle. Gilbert Seldis, the publisher and translator of this new version, introduced the text as one that is still viable as a living play, and, in relation to this translation, works particularly well as quote-unquote a rowdy farce. Yet taking a more serious turn, he argues that this farce succeeds because Aristophanes romanticized neither love nor war, but instead treated them both with, quote, hard-headed intelligence, with realism. And Seldis later specifies that this realism is the realism not just of ancient Greece, but also of his own day, of the early 1930s. Aristophanes lived through the Peloponnesian War and witnessed the fall of Athens. Seldis writes, quote, he saw in effect what many people think we are seeing today, the downfall of civilization, and that is probably another reason why he is so sympathetic to us, end quote. At other moments in the introduction, Seldis makes specific reference to what we now know as the First World War, but refuses a purely retrospective look. He wants to see Lysistrata as a parable for his time, a deadly serious farce written in the face of the potential for continued destruction. Thus, in keeping with Seldis's prescient introduction that foresaw continued worldwide violence, Picasso's warrior resonates with both the past and the future of the warrior image in Europe, particularly as the Nazi Party claimed the Hellenistic inheritance as its own in an attempt to legitimize the Third Reich. By the end of 1933, the Nazi Party would inaugurate the construction of the Temple of German Art in Munich with a highly publicized parade in which a bust of Hercules and a gilded statue of Pallas Athena allegorized sculpture amongst figures for the other arts. And by 1938, Athena's helmeted profile would introduce the infamous paired exhibitions of degenerate and German art. Picasso caricatures Aristophanes' helmeted warriors, depicting them with pouting lips, prodigious curling beards, and ever-changing decorations on their highly visible crests, while also honoring the text and following the narrative quite closely. The men are thus shown as at once highly ridiculous and highly serious. This same tone applies to Head of a Warrior. As Werner Spies has convincingly argued, physical deformation is usually value-free in Picasso's work, so that alone cannot account for the sculpture's humorous quality, but the juxtaposition of the unmodified crest with the deformed face can. Our warrior is quixotic. Propped up on his pipe with his bulbous nose and slight smirk, he is still adorned with the real vestments of battle. This almost pathetic quality, like that of the sex-starved soldiers Aristophanes imagined from within his own war-torn country, stands defensively against the serious increase of military force that accompanied Hitler's ascent. Head of a Warrior thus defends against both the art world and the larger world. It allowed Picasso to subtly, even humorously, assert his artistic vision, even as he mocked the figure of the warrior in the face of mounting disaster.
Merci beaucoup Anna Yohalem pour cet exposé très complet sur la tête casquée qui montre combien était importante la dimension ludique de cette sculpture, l'usage des matériaux, l'usage de l'empreinte, de la texture, de l'objet trouvé, de l'objet détourné et repris et noyé dans le plâtre, comme vous l'avez montré à travers notamment la radiographie de cette œuvre. Aussi à quel point cette œuvre était novatrice dans l'inscription de la sculpture dans l'espace. On a un usage du vide qui est assez fascinant pour cette sculpture et qui effectivement rappelle la boule suspendue de Giacometti de 1930. Et effectivement, vous avez bien rappelé tous les liens qu'on peut tisser avec l'Antiquité grecque, avec Lysistrata et le contexte historique de l'époque. Une question de François Bellet ?
Oui, deux choses. J'ai eu la chance de faire voyager le bronze. Et la caisse qui entoure le bronze, il faudrait le faire autour de la sculpture et dans des proportions absolument incroyables. C'est-à-dire qu'elle est très peu large. C'est-à-dire qu'elle tient dans un espace auquel on ne penserait pas. Donc ça serait amusant vis-à-vis du Giacometti. L'autre chose, moi je pense que c'est un autoportrait. C'est un autoportrait, vous prenez avec le nez le dernier dessin de lui, il est dans des histoires de femmes qui ne s'arrangent pas, mais pour moi c'est un autoportrait. C'est indéniable, je travaillerai peut-être dessus, mais je le pense, et pas du tout les histoires politiques et autres, puisque c'est Lysistrata, pas faire l'amour, la guerre et ainsi de suite, et il est en plein milieu de ça. Et l'apparition du Minotaure, avec la femme torero, enfin tout ce qui s'ensuit, et je crois qu'il faudrait faire une lecture plus sexuelle de cette sculpture.
Merci.
Merci François.
I wanted to ask, I've enjoyed very much your rigorous visual analysis and your technical attention as well. Since you've been insisting on contextualizing within the context of the interwar years and the changing properties of the classical during this time period, I wanted to ask you if you consider this piece in relationship to other, I would say, quasi-classical or other sculptures by Picasso from that time period where he engages with the theme of the classical. The most clear is The Orator, for example, or Man with Toga, and so forth.
So I was focusing predominantly on the Vollard suite images, which also are classical, and the Lysistrata, and less the other sculptures as I developed this, because I think the helmet is so important and so prevalent. But I think this idea, sort of as I finished writing this, it's like there's a whole other project that is the question of the changing status of the classical, and that is somewhere I would like to continue taking this. Yeah.
So can you hear me? I have just a very quick question. It's really a question to Werner Spies, but I don't think he's here because you quoted him by saying, in Picasso, physical deformation is value-free. I believe that's the quote.
That is.
What is meant by that?
I think, so he was talking about this work as a caricature, and often in typical caricature, it is the deformation of a face that makes it caricatural, but that doesn't work with Picasso because he deforms the body always. And so he was trying to account for the fact that this still was caricature, but we couldn't look to just the bulbous nose the way we could in a caricature in a newspaper.
So it's not caricature in a traditional way, but in a more inventive.
Yeah. Was how I understood the quotation.
Une dernière question.
Hi,
John
Hannah.
Finlay.
Hi there. Just to say that I enjoyed your talk. Just could you clarify something for me? Because you were talking about suspended ball, the Giacometti. Were you suggesting that Picasso had seen the plaster? Because the pier lobe is a wooden construction that 1930. It's a very different material. So I just wondered whether
Yeah.
Picasso is aware. You're saying he was aware of that plaster.
I actually was not aware that it was wooden originally, but I think the question of the forms and their responding formally to each other and his use of plaster as a way, Picasso's use of plaster as a way of creating unity, regardless of whether Giacometti's was plaster or not.
Well, all I'm saying is the first time we see that suspended ball is the wooden version of the pier lobe. So just keep that in mind when you're, making those technical analysis, But I can see the relationships between the two in the plaster, but that's just a little leap that was a little awkward. Sorry.
Thank you. No.
Merci John pour cette question. Je crois que nous allons devoir une dernière question de Sylvia Neja. Et ensuite, nous clôturerons la discussion.
An observation. The warrior was resurrected in 1963 in concrete at the Cooper House. And he saw that. It was one of the sculptors, the murals that Picasso saw of all the Neschar Picasso works. And he said it was too perfect.
Merci Sylvia.
Thank you Sylvia. Alors, nous appelons tout de suite Claire Fine. Merci encore Anna Yohalem.
Thank you.